getting started just a wee bit late, but I don't know if I will. Thank you so much. Okay.
See you by the time, everybody.
Make sure I have everything here.
That's at the end. That's why you're leaving.
So my name is Ann Bishop, and I'm the newest member of Therapy Gardens / Senior U. Senior U is our newest presentation that we go into some more modern, up-to-date information like artificial intelligence, marijuana for elders, and then I do some historical presentations. So, as I said, my name is Ann Bishop. I'm a retired pediatric nurse practitioner and an adjunct professor from Simmons University. And I have a master's degree in public health, which meant I specialized in health education and health promotion. So when I met Dave at a Therapy Garden herb gardening presentation, and I heard him say that he did a lot of health-related topics, I asked for a job. I had been working as an adjunct professor at Simmons, but with COVID, they started putting everything online. And in January of 2022, they wanted me to increase my class size by 3 and not change the compensation. So it really wasn't worth it anymore.
Simmons University, is it same as Simmons College in Boston?
Yeah, it's now Simmons University. Yeah. And when I retired in 2015, I went to volunteer at the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate as a visitor experience person. And they put me in charge of the children's groups because...
What's that located in?
Dorchester.
Oh.
Right next to the Kennedy Library.
I just assumed it was around here, and you said Simmons, and then you went to Washington.
Yeah, I'm from the Boston area.
Not Washington. Simmons Institute is
Simmons.
Columbia Point. It's the Edwin. Go ahead.
The Edward M. Kennedy Institute is right next to the JFK Library. So they put me in charge of doing the tours for the children because I was a pediatric nurse practitioner. So after 5 years, I was the one that had done the most children's tours. But COVID closed down that experience. However, I learned an incredible amount of information about the United States Senate, which included the first 3 women senators. So when Dave, hired me and I saw what he was presenting, I asked if we could include this, and he said yes. So that's how we got here. So the first woman senator is the best trivia question of all time, because at the Institute, I would ask people who was the first woman senator, and most people would say Margaret Chase Smith. And she was the first woman elected on her own to the United States Senate, but she was not the first woman senator. Even Harvard history professors could not answer this question. And the reason is because she was only a senator for 24 hours. But her story of how she got there is absolutely fascinating. And I still haven't cracked her whole history. She wrote 3 books in her 80s describing her life in rural Georgia during slavery, the Civil War, construction, and her time as a political wife. She was born in Decatur, Georgia in 1835, and she died in 1930. I think she was 89. She was born on a 725-acre plantation, and in one of her books, she describes what it was like for her family, who moved from an area along the Potomac River where they had lived as a family generationally since the 1600s. They were related to the original Baltimore family, and they were the Marshall family. And they lived in this huge mansion. But there was a new law passed where people could go west and get land. Now, of course, the land was taken from somebody, correct? The land was taken from the Native Americans. And in Georgia, we don't think of Native Americans in Georgia, but it was the largest Cherokee nation. And there were many, many interactions with Native Americans. In fact, when she was 3, the Veil of Tears happened, and she had memories of that. But she wrote in her book that her father often told his daughters of crossing the Potomac River on a flatboat. The family left behind them the splendid brick residence, the capacious barn and outbuildings, all built of brick, perfectly sound and useful at this present time. This is 1922. A home of former wealth and luxury to a life of adventure, fortune, and happiness in a sparsely settled country, fully half of which was still inhabited by Red Indians. This is her words. They also had to leave the graves of their kindred in the cemetery, which is still enclosed at Marshall Hall and full of martial dead. And there is a national park there that holds the ruins of the Marshall home, but it also speaks to the legacy of the Marshall people. So when they get to Georgia, they had money. So they bought a home that was described as the colonial style white columns like the ones that you see in the movies of the South. At the time, 17% of the population was enslaved, so that was close to 88,000 people. The total population at that time was approximately 517,000 people. So not a lot of people.
Is that, you say 87,000, that's the whole state of Georgia?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. And we don't know how many Native Americans were there because they didn't take a census of Native Americans until 1860. But we do know that it was their land, and there were many tribes there, but mainly the Cherokee. Her father was Charles Latimer, and her mother was Eleanor Swift Latimer. And the Latimers, as I said, go back generations, intermarried with the Marshalls, and she wrote her genealogy in one of her books, and I was reading it last night, and she diligently, in her late 80s, went to the Library of Congress and wrote out all her genealogy. She was really a very bright woman. She attended the Madison Female College in Madison, Georgia, and graduated at the top of her class at age 18. So it was uncommon. So colleges were like highfalutin high schools. They went from the grammar school, or they would be called the common school, to the next level, and they would graduate. In that place, she studied Greek, Latin, geography, and was prepared to be a teacher. So she was quite smart. And this is not her home, but an example of what the plantation might have looked like. And there were slaves, enslaved people. It's very interesting when she writes her memoirs, what she calls the enslaved people. She rarely uses the word slave. She talks about the household, the Negroes. That she hardly ever uses the word slave. So at her graduation, the speaker was William H. Fenton. He was a physician, later a legislator, a Methodist minister, and a plantation owner with enslaved people. He was born in 1823 and died in 1909. They were married in October of 1853. Father insisted that they met when she was almost 18, and father insisted they had to wait until she was at least 18. And he already had a home and some children, and the two of them get married, and they have 5 children, but only one, Howard, survives into adulthood. In those days, children died from influenza, tuberculosis, infections, and I'm not sure what else. It does, for me again, I'm not a historian, I'm interested in history. There's just so much information out there, and we'd be talking for days, so I tried to keep it concise. She enjoyed the privileges of being a wealthy plantation mistress. And again, in her own words, she describes how, what life was like. The daughters, so in her home, you get the impression that there's this huge house and there's the slave quarters. But there were slaves that worked in the fields, obviously, and there were slaves that worked in the house. And those that worked in the house worked very closely together. They weren't as separated as we might think. And in the basement of the house was where the slaves worked. But often the mistress would be down there directing all the work. And so this part of her story says the daughters were taught to spin and weave. So she's talking about her sisters, and to knit and sew, and to overlook the dairy as the mother directed. There was plenty of work for all because a large slave family had to be clothed from that busy loom. So they would make the cloth, and the slave folks would make the clothing for themselves. And the house had to be kept, this is when she's living as a child in her father's house. The house had to be kept in apple pie order. And they had lots of people. There was only, a small amount of people living, 500,000 people living in the whole state of Georgia. So in their little area, they were very social. They did a lot of things together, and a wedding was a big deal. It would go on for 3 days. It was quite something. But she describes in her memoirs as having a considerable number of slaves, both at her father's house and at her husband's house. But she also describes her existence as that of a sheltered potted plant. She said that the only benefit they had as a woman in those days was protection, that they could make no decisions. They were given directives, so she was in charge of the household, but they were only given protection from her husband that they could count on, and only if they obeyed him. So they could be thrown out if they didn't like what was going on. And this is a picture of her husband. He looks a bit stern. He was a doctor and a minister, so I'm pretty sure he was used to being the top dog. Yeah. So the Civil War breaks out, and William joins the Confederate Army as an MD. Interestingly enough, Rebecca's ancestors were close to George Washington and pledged allegiance to George Washington during the Revolutionary War. So it was sort of interesting that they ended up in the Confederate Army. He comes home and decides to run for Congress and becomes a congressional representative. He serves 3 terms in Washington, and then serves 3 terms in the state legislature. So besides his being a plantation owner, he's a political man. So Rebecca, very smart, let's not underestimate her intelligence. She becomes his campaign manager, helps write his speeches, and was an equal partner in his political life. Later in life, she was known as the Grande Dame of Georgian politics because everybody knew her. In 1885, she buys a newspaper to promote his career. And later, she writes for the Atlanta Journal for over 20 years. And the journal was like a home companion type of thing, but it kept her in touch with the people. So she would respond to what the people wanted to hear about. And there's no TV, there's no media, there's no cell phones. So the newspaper was the way that they got their information. So you were very close to the person who was writing all this stuff. The politicians weren't crazy about her equal partnership with her husband, and they often called her the she of Georgia, which was supposed to insult her, but she wasn't insulted. And in 1911, she writes her Memoirs of Georgia Politics, and in 1919, she writes Country Life in Georgia in the Days of My Youth. and she writes a lot about the Native Americans. There were lots of interactions with them that had to do with trade, and it seemed like it was accepted that they were cohabiting. There weren't a lot of, from her words, I haven't looked into it more deeply, but in her words, there wasn't a lot of conflict. They traded and got along. It was, you just wonder what went on between the Native Americans and the African Americans at that time. There must have
You
been.
don't often hear much about Native Americans in Georgia.
Right.
I mean, at least when I
Right.
hear Indian or Native American, I think of the Wild West.
Right.
But
Right.
not Georgia.
Well, the same thing with Oklahoma.
Yeah.
Oklahoma, we know the musical Oklahoma, right?
Yeah.
There was no town in Oklahoma that did not have Native Americans.
I was stationed in Fort Sill for like a
Yeah.
month and a half when I was in Fort Hood, Texas, and there was a lot of
Yeah,
Native Americans that lived
Yeah.
there.
yeah.
That, and I believe Arizona's big for that.
It's the lack of our education.
I was gonna say, there was not a lot of the education about how many American Indians were here when the Pilgrims came.
That's right.
I thought Massachusetts and a few in the West.
There were hundreds of tribes
Yes,
across the
there were,
country.
yeah.
And in Georgia alone, if you look for a census, there's at least 12 tribes that were in Georgia.
And let's not forget the suppression of facts.
Right,
We were getting the white man's view of things and what
Right.
they wanted us to know.
to know, yep,
We weren't getting just all the facts, we were getting certain
Right.
facts.
We would go
That's
to,
right.
when we were kids, go to see the cowboy movies, always go for the cowboys, because to us, the Indians were the bad people. It
right.
was the other way around.
Oh, yeah.
We should have been rooting for the Indians.
Every
I'm
Saturday
sorry,
morning.
the Native Americans, excuse me. Yeah.
I can remember as a kid growing up, just the word Indian terrified us.
Yeah,
It was, and I can't even express now why.
except for
At that
Tonto,
time,
which is probably not a good thing, but everybody liked Tonto.
I have Native ancestry on both my maternal and paternal line. My
Yeah.
family comes out of Canada,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of French people up there have Native blood.
Yeah.
And there's logical reasons for that we won't go into. But until the Filles du Roi, which is the daughters of the king, was shipped over, the men were here trying to make a settlement to get ready.
Right,
But we all know what happens.
Right.
So a lot of French people have Native ancestry. My mother told me that when she was a little girl, that was back during the Depression, and she was told by my grandmother, you don't tell anybody that you have any kind of
that's true.
Indian background,
yep,
because you will suffer for it if you do.
yep,
That runs up almost into modern day.
yep,
Oh, absolutely.
20 years ago, you never would have said, I'm part Indian.
No.
yeah,
Absolutely.
Never would have said
I
that.
proudly say it now, but I'm saying my mother's generation, she was told by my grandmother, you just zip your lip.
yep,
My grandfather grew up in Maine, and when we were kids, he had a family up there who were I'm not sure what tribe they were Indian, I'm sorry, Native American, excuse me. And they lived in Old Town. You ever heard of Old Town, Maine?
not sure.
I think it's
Absolutely.
on the coast. And we used to go as kids, they lived on a reservation. Pine Grove area, beautiful, they had
Yes.
a pond, an outhouse with 3 holes, okay? I remember going to that thing, but it was beautiful up there. Pine Grove area, oh, it was awesome. What tribe they were, I'm not sure.
So how did she become the first woman senator?
Her husband probably died.
Well, yes, but her husband died in 1909 and she didn't become a senator until 1922.
Oh.
Another marriage.
Well, that's when somebody else died in office, right there, it says.
Okay, but let's start at the beginning, okay? So out of the blue, she gets picked? No, she gets picked because of her history. So in 1890, she campaigns for prohibition, very popular in the South, leasing convicts. Okay, so in those days, they had the chain gangs, and she was very much against that, and women's rights. Now, the dark side of Rebecca is women's rights for white women.
Of course.
She wrote for the Atlantic Journal for 2 decades, as I mentioned. And then in so after her husband dies, she's writing for the Atlantic Journal, and she's still living a comfortable life. September 16th, 1922, Senator Thomas Watson dies in office. The governor at the time wanted the job, but he did not vote for suffrage. And Rebecca was nationwide known for being a suffragist. So he decides he's going to put Rebecca in for the 4 months that there's an opening before the next election. And he appoints her. However, Walter George, a known suffragist, was also running for office, and he gets elected. However, she is appointed for those 4 months. Yet, think back to that time, still not a lot of senators. We still don't have the 100 senators that we have today. The country is still young, and there's no women. So the men said, well, that's fine, lady, but we're not gonna give you the oath to become a real senator. You can just sit in that seat. And they put her way at the back of the Senate. So when Walter George finds out the situation, he tells the government, I am not going to be sworn in until she is sworn in. So 24 hours before his swearing in, Rebecca is sworn in as the first woman senator. And she makes her morning speech on the value of women in politics. And then the new senator takes over.
So what you're saying is for almost 4 months, she sat in the back and did nothing and was not sworn in to office?
Yep.
She was on for 1 day, was it?
1 day.
For 1 day, okay.
Right.
Until he got some.
Right. Now remember, women only had the vote for 2 years. It was still a new thing, so it's quite typical of the time. There were not a lot of Renaissance men in that.
That was an astounding
Totally.
thing that Walter George did.
Was very brave.
Very brave of him.
He must have been an outcast once he was finally.
No, I don't know. He was a known suffragist.
No,
So,
but I mean,
yeah.
when he was finally in the Senate.
Yeah,
Because
they
were
probably
so-
forgave him. She was only there for 1 day.
I don't know. They
Well,
won
yeah,
that.
it was a token.
Yeah, it was a token. So here's some other difficult things about Rebecca. She's a woman of her time, raised to be a plantation mistress with enslaved people as part of her history. She's left to manage a plantation during the Civil War. So imagine this. The men leave, all the men, except maybe someone to manage the plantation. And the women are left in charge with the enslaved people who the war is being fought to free. So they knew that. So the women changed. There's a lot of information out there that says the relationships changed and they got more protective of themselves. And they worried about the war and they worried about their husbands. Whatever her feelings were towards Black people before this, she had a woman, Nurse Agnes, that's what she called her, but she was an enslaved woman who practically raised her, who was by her side all the time. Mm-hmm. Whatever her feelings were, the fear of Black men overtook the women, and she became a supporter of lynching.
She became a what?
A supporter of lynching. And the main reason was, this is her words, if lynching would protect women's dearest possession, meaning their virginity, from the ravening human beasts, which she often referred to the Black people as, then I say lynch 1,000 times a week if necessary. And this was published, and she had to accept that there was a lot of negativity about this, but there wasn't a whole lot of negativity.
When she says human beings, she's basically talking
Talking about Black people.
Men, not women.
Yeah, Yeah.
Just the black.
Right.
Right.
Because her whole thing was fear of being raped.
Right.
That was her whole thing. So overall, the history of Georgia, overall, there were 458 lynch victims. I could not find information on that era. Most of them happened in the early 1900s. They were the next highest, the highest was Mississippi for 538, and then the next highest was Georgia. So it was a fairly common practice.
Count.
They kept count, the historians went back, and this is what
I wonder
their
how many
numbers,
took place that we're never known though.
that's absolutely
May-
true.
May I ask, when she wrote that article, what year are we talking? Lynching was, are we talking during the Civil War, are we talking in the
No.
1900s, 1920s?
This was, let me see, I'm gonna have to look
Yeah,
that,
that's okay, it's just that it makes a difference to me, it seems.
Right.
Because here she is, woman suffers
I
and
think-
all of that kind of stuff, chain gang stuff, and then going to,
Sounds like it would be during the war though, I think you're right.
yeah, I think it was,
Because that's when the
Yeah.
men went away.
yeah, I think I have it in
So,
my,
alone.
I think I have it in my papers, but I don't
Except more of
wanna,
the lynchings took place really in the early 1900s.
right.
You know,
I think it's in my papers, but I don't wanna stop for that.
yeah.
And this is her in her old age,
Wow.
playing her guitar, living out her life. In her one and only speech before the Senate, she spoke on the value of women in politics. She was assigned a seat at the back of the Senate that was subsequently given to another early woman senator that we'll discuss. She continued to write and lecture until her final days. She was 94 when she died. She finished her final book, The Romantic Story of Georgia Women, shortly before her death in 1930. She's buried at Oak Hill Cemetery, and there are papers and memorabilia about her life at the Rose Lawn Museum. This is all in Georgia. So that's our first woman senator and your best trivia question. If you have any smart people in your family, say, I know something you don't know. Who was the first woman
I
senator?
have to worry about nobody in my family's smart, but anyway.
The second woman senator was Hattie Caraway, but I'm saving her for the last because she's a longer story. The third woman senator was Rose McConnell Long. Can anybody guess who she was married to?
Mr.
Howie
Long?
Long?
Huey Long.
Who?
Huey Long.
That's his wife?
That's his wife.
And Louise.
I was close, I said Mr. Long.
Yep.
I've heard of him, of course, but never her.
Well, here's her story.
Now you have.
She's born in 1892 in Indiana, and she died in Boulder, Colorado in 1970. Her parents were Peter and Armitage or Sally McConnell. Rose had one brother, Gilman. Her father had a daughter from a previous marriage. So the family moved from Indiana to Shreveport, Louisiana when Rose was 9 years old for a better life. She attended public schools and then a secretarial school, but ultimately worked as a teacher. Her brother became a veterinarian. And in those days, they didn't really go to veterinarian school. They were like apprentices, and maybe they had some anatomy, I'm not sure. At 18, Rose enters a baking contest to promote cotton lean, a lard substitute. And Huey Long, a local salesman, was one of the judges. And that's how they met.
Now, who's this Huey Long? I don't know who that is.
So he was a senator that
Okay.
was assassinated at age 42 and wanted to become president
Okay.
in Congress. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about him in the
What years
next.
were these?
Okay, so right now they're married. So next slide will tell us some more information.
Okay.
So they had a 2.5-year courtship ending in marriage in a hotel in Memphis, Tennessee in April 1913. He had to borrow money from Rose to pay for the service. They just went to a town hall. They were not doing too well. And this is just a picture of the two of them when he was in Congress. So she worked as a school teacher while Huey attended law school. So he had a lot of ambition. And as it says further down, he inherited his mother's intelligence and a photographic memory, which is really an asset if you want to be in politics, right? They had 3 children, Rose Lolita Long McFarland, Palmer Reed Long, and Russell Long. And Russell Long also became a senator from Louisiana. Huey Long was known as the Kingfisher boss. So he is the senator from Louisiana, and he is so smart and so influential and so charismatic that people follow him. And he was known as the boss. But it also meant that he was kind of the boss. It was my way or the highway. His motto, though, was share the wealth. His mother taught the children to care about poor people, and she would make up food baskets and have her children take the food baskets around to the poor people in the town. And he got his sense of, giving back to the people that needed it the most. He's known for his social programs, his public work projects, and for having a heavy hand. They tried to impeach him in Congress, but it didn't go anywhere. Rose supported her husband's career as governor of Louisiana from 1928 to 1932, U.S. Senator from 1932 to 1935 when he was assassinated at age 42. She was the hostess. So her job was to be the mother and the hostess. He was an important politician, and they entertained a lot of people, including Hattie Caraway's husband, Thaddeus, which later becomes important. She was known as a devoted mother and wife who supported her husband and acted as the society hostess as was expected. She had no known political aspirations, but was well aware of the politics of the day. So she knew who was who, and who do you talk to, and who do you give the coffee to, and who do you give the drink to, and she managed well his political adjunct life. And she knew all about his politics. After her husband's death, she moves to Baton Rouge to be near her son Russell, who was attending Louisiana State University. So now, Louisiana Governor James Noe enacts the widow's succession. So that was a new thought at this time. So when a senator dies in office, they appoint the wife to stay the rest of his term until the special election. It was honorary, but they do get sworn in, not like poor Rebecca. They do get sworn in. However, and so Rose is the placeholder until the special election. However, Rose decides to run at the encouragement of people like her husband's friends, including Thaddeus Caraway, who's our husband of the third person we're going to talk about. However, she wins that special election to complete her husband's term between 1935 and obviously 1937. That's a mistake. I was doing it late last night. 1937. So she's in office for a little over a year. But she chooses not to seek election in the fall of, again, 1936. She was to be named senator as Mrs. Huey Long, but she says, no, no, no. I am Rose McConnell Long.
Sounds like Hillary Rodham Clinton.
Mm-hmm. So this was a big deal in those days. Women, I mean, wasn't I Mrs. So-and-so Bishop,
You know what, you weren't, from an etiquette point of view, after your husband dies, when you address, because I used to do this,
Okay,
my Aunt Betty, when her husband died, was no longer Mrs. William J. Harvey. You were to address her as Mrs. A. Elizabeth Harvey. So
Okay.
from an etiquette point of view, she was correct.
Yeah,
okay,
definitely.
right. So she insisted she be listed as Senator Rose McConnell Long. Rose and Hattie Caraway. So Hattie Caraway is elected before, is in Congress before Rose. So Hattie Caraway were often seen together at the back of the Senate chamber, where Hattie had been assigned the Rebecca Latimer Felton seat. And Rose supported all of her husband's policies and was said to serve with intelligence, diligence, and grace. After her time in the Senate, she moves to Boulder, Colorado to be near her daughter, Dolly, who had served as her mother's secretary. She was 78 years old. And so she had a short term, but she was,
I wonder why she decided not to run again.
well, she was not raised to be a politician. There was probably a lot of encouragement for her to complete the term so other senators could get their campaigns together and make a play for that senatorial seat. And she was a supporter of her husband's policies, so the people that supported those policies wanted to see her stay until the next regular election. So when there's a senator, it's every 6 years. So she was closing in on the 6-year time when there was going to have to be a new one. So Rose and Hattie were friends, and they were often seen together. Hattie Ophelia Wyatt Caraway. She is somebody that I just love to talk about. She was born in 1878 in Humphrey County, Tennessee. She's from Tennessee. She died in 1950 in Falls Church, Virginia, and she was from Arkansas. Now she has such an interesting history. It's like where's Steven Spielberg when we need him? We need a story. She's born on a family farm in Bakersville.
They're making a movie about it, by the way.
I would love it. She's born on the family farm in Bakersville, and the family moved to Huttsburg nearby, the birthplace of Loretta Lynn. Wow. So it's a poor area, okay? Her father, William, was married with 6 children to a woman named Harriet O'Glynn, who died. Then he marries Hattie's mother, Lucy Mildred Birch, and they have 4 children, George Walter Moselle, known as Mosey, and Hattie, the youngest. The family of 12 lived and worked on a small farm and ran a small general store, 12 of them. Hattie's father was 60 when she was born, and her mother was 36.
Oh, quite a difference.
Yeah, a little bit.
They were a family of modest means who worked very hard for everything that they had. But you can imagine there's 12 kids in the family, so they're working the farm and somebody's in the store. Hattie was not happy on the farm. She's like, this is not for me. And she convinced an aunt to pay for her education. So if I get good grades, will you pay for me to go to school? So she and her sister Mosey attend the Dixon Normal School, later known as the Dixon Normal College in Dixon, Tennessee. She entered at age 14. So remember, who knows how much schooling she got, if their mother taught them at home. I'm not clear on that. There is a book, a little, one of those informational books that has more pictures in it if people want to take a look at it. Maybe it says in there, but again, there's so much to talk about.
On page,
That was typical.
more than likely, she probably did get home tutoring, I would say.
Yeah, they couldn't really send them off to school.
They didn't go to school because they were all working in the farms, right?
Yeah. So she entered at age 14, graduates 4 years later with a Bachelor of Arts, and becomes a school teacher. And at this Dixon Normal School, the reason she wanted to go there is because, again, she learned Greek and Latin and geography and mathematics, and was a good education for women at that time. And this is Hattie with her husband, Thaddeus. So she meets Thaddeus, or Thad Caraway, at the Dixon School. Thad was born in 1871 in Spring Hill, Missouri. His father was a physician and a Confederate veteran. So this Confederacy is important because it permeates their philosophy and belief system. When Thad was 6 months old, his father was killed in a duel that left the family destitute. So this is around 1871, 72, probably 1872. So they're destitute. They have no money. So in order for him to continue going to school, he has to work. At age 7, he's working as a farmhand, as a sharecropper on the railroad. Now, the laws for child labor were not passed until 1934, I think, when Perkins, the first, what's her name, Perkins? The first woman Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins, under FDR. He wants to appoint her, and she says, no way until you pass child labor laws, because minimum 1 in 5 children up until that time were working on farms, in factories, in mills.
Oh, yeah.
And so Felix Frankfurter is a senator at the time, and FDR tells Felix Frankfurter, get this bill passed. He only stays in the Senate a short period of time before he's made a Supreme Court justice, and he's got a big history too. But that's how we got child labor laws. Up until 1934, they didn't have any. So it wasn't unusual for these young children, especially in these poor areas, to be working these different jobs.
They had to work more or less
Yeah.
to feed themselves
Yeah.
as well as their family.
Yeah. He paid for his tuition at the Dixon School by working in a sawmill and picking cotton. Like Hattie, he worked as a school teacher while studying law, but he also had big ambitions. They were married after 6 years when Hattie was 24 and he was 30, and he had established his law practice. He wouldn't marry her until he could support her and a family, which they expected to have. They moved to Jonesboro, Arizona, where Hattie managed a small cotton plantation, while Thad went from a law practice to attorney general to be elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from 1912 to 1920. They had 2 children at this time, Paul and Forrest, and she was managing the farm, and she was secretary for the local 20th Century Club, a ladies' club, until they moved to Washington in 1913. This is important because it meant that she was aware of community needs. So this organization looked at community needs. And because of her background on a farm, she was sensitive to the needs of farm workers. And so she paid a lot of attention, and there was a lot of social service done through this. And she was the secretary, so that meant she knew all the people. So she's not thinking of becoming a senator, but she's actually in preparation to become a senator. Now, there's a sad part to her life. Her youngest son, Bobby, was born in 1915, and he died in 1934 at West Point. He was a horseman, and he fell off his horse and went into a coma. And she arrived just before he passed away. And
What, 19 at the time? Something?
he was about 19, yeah. So he was born while they were in Washington, and it broke her heart. She really never got over that. In 1920, Thad becomes a U.S. Senator, and the family moves into the Calvert Mansion, which is this huge, huge, beautiful home.
Now, she was the second senator, you said?
She's the second one,
You
yeah.
said you were going to talk about it, okay.
Yeah. And Huey Long had made use of the property during his 1932 campaign. So the Caraways and the Longs were close friends because Huey wanted to run for president. So he was making friends all over the South. Thad died in 1931 at age 60 from a blood clot after kidney stone surgery. Probably would have been saved today because they would be doing MRIs when he had chest pain, and actually he had a cerebral clot, but he might have survived. So Hattie is a strong supporter of her husband's policies and was very active behind the scenes. She often spoke on his behalf, knew all of his positions on issues affecting constituents of Arkansas, such as progressive programs to help farmers and people affected by the Great Depression. She supported entrance into the League of Nations, bonuses for veterans, prohibition, and women's suffrage. And in the book that I passed around, there are pictures of her with her constituents, and you can see that they're very poor farmer people. Unfortunately, her husband also supported segregation, specifically legislation to prohibit African Americans from entering the Army or Navy, which didn't pass, but he was a supporter of that. And he supported segregating public and private transportation in Washington, D.C. So these were the Southern roots that were descended from Confederates. After his death, Hattie benefits from the widow's succession. Governor Harvey Pennell considers her a safe choice. He has no thought in his mind that she wants to be a senator. She takes her seat on December 8th, 1931, and she decides she's going to run for the special election, which she does. And Huey Long helped her along with that, with his influence. She wanted to fulfill her husband's tenure. And she was elected in large part by the Arkansas Democratic Women's Club, who knew of her because of her other club associations. And they got out the women's vote because they had only had the vote for less than a decade. She was known to say, okay, so Hattie shocks the political establishment and wins the Senate seat on her own for the next 2 terms. She was known to say, the time has passed when a woman should be placed in a position and kept there only while someone else is being groomed for the job. And, you know, that still happens today. Not specifically the Senate, but in corporations, you know. Elected with the help of Huey Long was eyeing the White House and the women's vote. She was given the same seat as Rebecca Felton. She only gave 15 speeches. She said, I haven't the heart to take a minute away from the men. The poor dears love it so. She was a strong supporter of FDR's New Deal, and he knew of her. Farm relief and flood control, the Tennessee Valley Authority Act happened during that time. The entrance into World War II, veterans, and she disliked lobbyists. Good for her. She was methodical in attending to constituents concerned. If she wasn't in Washington, D.C., she was at home going to what do they call them? Granaries and, you know, town halls, and had offices where people could go and make a complaint. She was kind of an early Ted Kennedy, because that's what he was known for. If you go to Ted Kennedy, he's going to answer your call. So in the early part of the Iraq War, a number of men were killed inside the safe zone because they were not issued the flak jackets to protect them. And one of the mothers went to Ted Kennedy, and within 2 weeks, the law had been changed and everybody got them. So he was well known, and as was she. She was the first woman to chair a committee. The committee was called Enrolled Bills. She was the first woman to preside over the Senate. She was the first woman to run a Senate hearing. And she sat on the Commerce Committee and the Agriculture and Forestry Committee. Her record on civil rights was a mixture of Southern conservative beliefs and more liberal thoughts on equality. I often wonder how people compartmentalized women's rights but couldn't quite get to African American rights or Native American rights when they were such strong supporters of women's rights.
White women.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, the whole history of the suffrage movement between, you know.
Particularly in the South, though.
Yeah, but even in.
The good old white boys network down there.
Right.
Nothing's changed.
No.
She supported Lucretia Mott's Equal Rights Amendment in 1943. Remember, it wasn't just in our time, it was back in 1943 when we might not have been born. She joined.
Close.
She voted against the anti-lynching law. I mean, what were the politics behind that she couldn't say this is wrong? And it was brought up twice before it was passed. She joined the Southern senator filibuster to defeat a bill proposed to eliminate the poll tax, which was against African Americans and poor people. But on her final day as senator, she receives a standing ovation from her all-male colleagues. after she leaves office, FDR appoints her to the Employees Compensation Commission, and Harry Truman appoints her to the Employees Compensation Board. She stayed on that board until she suffers a stroke in 1950 and passed away about a year later. She's buried with her husband and her son in Arkansas. And this is my final picture of Hattie and Rose. So Hattie is on the left and Rose is on the right. When they they were together in the Senate for a 4-month period of time. And they were good friends because they had been friends before. And so that is an overview, because there is so much more I'm sure we could say, of the first 3 women senators that you never heard of.
I have a question. That all 3 were from down south, correct?
Correct.
Were they more known down there than up north, or just
Well,
happened to be? They just happened to be.
The suffrage movement, the people knew about the suffrage movement. They knew who were the heroes or heroines and who were the troublemakers. They were the same people, but some people saw them as troublemakers and some
And
people.
probably because down south they had the plantation, that probably kind of helped a little bit too. Because
Who can
they
say?
were probably against that.
Yeah. Yep. But isn't that just fascinating?
It is.
Yeah, I think it's a really good story. And Frances Perkins is another really interesting person that I'm thinking of putting a program together. She was great friends with Eleanor, but she was a brilliant woman in her own right and was the first woman Secretary of Labor under FDR and did get child labor laws passed, which is really important.
I know I could look it up on Google or Wikipedia or whatever, but could you give us a brief reason or summary of why Huey Long was assassinated?
I was gonna ask that question.
Because he was for poor people.
Because what?
He was for poor people. He was a Democrat he was probably accused of socialist behavior. You know, he wanted to spread the wealth.
Yeah.
And the people in power don't like that. There was a lot of corruption. Back in Georgia, there was a big scandal that the politicians, all the way up to the White House, swindled people out of their land and then double sold the land, and the law didn't protect anybody. And finally, a commission came in and tried to make up compensation for people. But a lot of people got their land in Georgia illegally, basically. There was a lot of corruption back then. And
But Huey Long was from Louisiana.
yes, he was from Louisiana. But Louisiana is one of our poorest
Right, but you
states.
were mentioning George's
Right.
little scandal, yeah.
Was one particular person accused and judged to be his assassin, or was it
Yeah.
a group?
I think it was, I think it was a member of a group.
Yeah.
I mean, the people that do the assassinating are usually,
Yeah.
they're off on a
Six on a
different,
shot of a dozen? There you go.
they're focused on something and don't see anything else.
Like
You
John
know.
Hinckley.
Yeah, like Hinckley and like John Wilkes Booth and whoever
Who was the one
assassinated
who shot Robert Kennedy? What's his name?
Sirhan,
He shot Ruby.
Oh, okay. What do I know?
No,
Sirhan was.
Sirhan shot Robert Kennedy. Yeah,
Jack Ruby.
Jack Ruby shot
Oswald.
Oswald.
So just very briefly.
Yep.
So, Wikipedia says that Long was shot at the state capitol in Louisiana, in Baton Rouge, because he had wanted to pass a redistricting bill, okay?
Okay, that's right.
And so, after the passing of the bill, Long was ambushed in the hallway by this man, Carl Weiss, who was the son-in-law of the judge who was against this redistricting, that the redistricting was going to push the judge out of office. So it was the son-in-law, so it was a personal vendetta to a point.
But to kill a United States senator, you have to understand that's the end of your life, and if you don't, then
People
you're,
aren't thinking
they're not thinking rationally, so I still say the people that do this are not
And I was
average.
saying, they hear voices in their heads, and the voices told me to do it, you know.
But don't forget, we're not that far after the guy with dying from the duel, right? I mean, dying from dueling.
Oh, from dueling,
It's
yeah.
such a personal thing, you know, this judge was pushed out of
I
office
was
and this.
curious about that, the woman whose husband said, was it who died, result of a duel?
Anyway,
It makes you wonder what caused the duel.
Well, most of the time they were fighting over land issues. This is nothing to do with what I just talked about, but my ex-husband's family dates back to Rebecca Nurse, one of the first women hanged for being a witch. She was hanged because her husband was swindling people out of land, and they couldn't get to him, so they accused her of being a witch, which discredited him.
How devious.
Yeah, and the reason I know that is because some very interested person went back in time and documented it, and it's on the internet, like every single, from my ex-husband's family, all the way back to Rebecca Nurse and the situation that happened at the time.
Was he related to that era? Your ex?
My ex-husband's ancestry goes back to Rebecca Nurse.
So that he was related,
Yeah. Yeah, do the Twombly's, I think, which, you know. And that line of people, many of them were super smart, super successful. She was a herbalist.
Would that make your ex-husband a warlock? Oh, anyway.
She might think so.
I'm not gonna say.
I have an ex-wife too, so.
He was a good provider and a good father, so, just wasn't meant to be.
Explain Margaret K. Smith.
So she is elected on her own from Maine. So
What do you mean on her own?
So she wasn't a widow's succession or appointed to fill in for somebody.
Oh, okay.
She was elected on her own.
Okay.
You know,
She was from Maine?
yeah.
So we did have somebody from up north then.
Well, that wasn't until the
That was
1950s, you know, so, and there weren't two women in Congress for decades after Hattie and Rose. So I always just think, you know, they were confined. They were much more confined than we are as women. But these women were smart, and all of the work that they did supporting somebody gave them information that was like an education, like being an apprentice to being a senator. They knew all the ins and outs of the Senate. They knew all the players. They knew how to behave. They knew what to
play the game.
Yeah, they did, and they did it well. They did it well.
Well, that was a wonderful presentation.
Yeah.
Back then too. I
Yeah,
said they think we have bad politics now, but they had it back then.
right. So I want to
Nothing new.
I want to remind you folks that Therapy Gardens has a website. These are the new ones. These are the old ones. So you can go on to therapygardens.com, and you are going to find all kinds of really great information about food
Thank you.
and other topics.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's all right. Thank you.
And one of the others, so you
Thank you
might
so
you might
much.
think about this at some
you.
time.
Oh, let me give you this while you're.
Oh, right.
Thank you.
Where are they located? It doesn't seem to.
So his office is on his home. So this is Brock. If you want one. So let me tell you one other presentation that I do that you might be interested in. My other historical one. So my father was the son of Polish immigrants. They immigrated through Russia, France, England to Ellis Island. Supposedly they didn't know each other, my grandparents. But we found some letters that said maybe that's,
Did they come from the same area?
They came from the same area, yeah, and they supposedly didn't know each other. But my mom found some letters written in Polish before, my mother passed away at 103 and 8 months
Oh, my
in
goodness.
August of
Wow.
2022.
What genes you have?
But she had all of her marbles and all of her memory for long term. May not be able to tell you what you had for breakfast yesterday, but she could tell you anything about the past. And so they ended up in Nashua, and my grandfather was a chef. He was 25 when he came over. He was a chef in Russia, and when they came over here, he was working as a laborer, but he finally got himself a job as a chef. When my father was 8 and his 2 twin sisters were 4, my grandmother died in childbirth. And in those days, the children were called half orphans. So the New England Home for Little Wanderers would let the remaining parent pay for their care, and they would put them in foster care, and the parent could visit them regularly. And that's what happened to my father and his twin sisters until he was 15 and they were 12. And then it's, 1940, there's not a lot of jobs. He went out to Colorado trying to get into a...
At age 15, he was on his own?
No, the father brought them back together again. Sorry, the father brought them back. So then he joins the army. He gets sent to the Philippines, and quickly he survives the Bataan Death March, 3.5 years in Japanese prison camp, and comes home and one of the founding members in Boston of the American Defenders of Bataan and Corregidor that became national. And that's all I'm going to tell you, because
Can you say that again, the American
Defenders of Bataan and Corregidor.
Oh, okay, I know Bataan and Corregidor, okay.
Yeah, so I give his talk, which is in his own words.
That's
Did
wonderful.
you say your grandparents both came from Russia?
They came from Vilnius.
Yeah.
Now, Vilnius was sometimes Poland, sometimes Lithuania, sometimes Latvia.
So you're not sure what nationality they were?
Well, we were always told we're Polish. We just
Okay.
may have lived in an area that wasn't Poland at the
You mentioned
time.
Russia first, I assume they were.
Well, they came from Russia because my grandfather was in Russia
Okay,
for a
so
while.
that's where they were both,
Yeah,
I guess.
and
Okay,
they,
probably Polish.
they were both in Russia. To get out of Russia, they had to go to a number of different
And that's
countries.
where he was a chef.
That's where he learned to be a chef, yeah. And he actually worked at the Ritz-Carlton. He worked at the big, I think it was the Cliff House. He worked at a big resort up in Maine. He worked in Nassau. But that's why he couldn't keep the kids. He had no family here. He had no one to take care of them. And he was being pushed around a lot.
So
And
they didn't know each other till they crossed Ellis Island? No?
We
You
don't
can't
know.
tell me- Okay. I'm sorry, I
they
can't tell me.
told my mother they met in Boston,
Well, they were.
in Nashua, but the letters say things like, "Why did you leave us, Genevieve? What were you thinking?" So we don't know.
You know, when you were speaking of them having to go to this, for the New England
Yeah.
Little Wanderers, whatever, I worked at Plymouth County Hospital when it was in Hanson, which was originally a TB hospital.
Yeah.
And I knew pretty well a woman who is now deceased, but she and her brother were brought up at the hospital. Their mother had tuberculosis. It was a TB hospital originally. She had tuberculosis, so she had to go there. The husband, the father, could not care for the children because he had to work. So the children lived at the hospital for a number of years, where they had a school right in that hospital to care for such children as they.
Yeah.
But as they say, everybody has a story.
Yeah.
And that is so true, isn't it?
It is.
And
I mean, can you imagine being 4 years old and ripped from your home and separated? They were all separated, and my father was with this very kind woman, and he begged her to bring the girls to her foster home, and they were together for a couple of years, but then they got
I
separated
was at my
again.
cousin's house, well, she lives like 3 houses down from me on my street. And I'm talking to her one day and she goes, I was doing my genealogy and this woman called me up. She's a school teacher, and happened to be a school teacher in Whitman at the middle school. I think she's from Abington. She wanted to know if I knew a Mary Joyce. And I said, yeah, that was my grandmother's sister. Well, her grandmother and my grandmother were Mary Joyce's sister. So I said, what's her name? And I called her up and I said, that was my grandmother's sister. She lived with us since I was a kid.
Yeah.
Her and her mother had never met her. Her grandfather happened to be my Aunt Mary, which my grandmother's sister, her son. And I didn't know the passage. What happened with my Aunt Mary ended up in had a nervous breakdown, ended up in a mental institution. My grandmother took her in, and I guess the father actually ended up living with a stepfather or something. So he didn't know much about his mother. And I was telling the stuff that I knew, okay? Stuff that I don't. I have a cousin who happened to be my other grandmother's sister's, it was his grandmother. He could tell you more of the history. I gave her his phone number. To this day, she hasn't called.
Oh, that's
But
too bad.
it's funny how,
Yeah.
they want to know information, so I'll be more than glad to talk to her.
Yeah.
But she never,
Well,
never
up until my mother died, she could tell you the address of every place she lived as a child. She could tell you the names of all her relatives, their birth dates, their death dates, and where they were buried. So we didn't need Ancestry.com. We just wrote it all down. And my brother, who was a printer and a writer, interviewed my parents and then looked up more history. So we have a booklet that has their history and
Ooh, you're very fortunate.
yeah.
But
Because
also,
not every family.
Now, what
has-
about your dad?
And so my dad, because my dad saved everything about the war, and he's at the Library of Congress. They have oral histories of veterans, and he is single-handedly responsible for every veteran in Massachusetts that was a POW, whether it was for 3 hours or 30 months, gets full 100% disability.
Excellent, excellent.
He worked.
Is he gone by now?
Yeah, my father died at 92 in 2009
Was
from,
he in the war? Was
he was
overseas?
World War, he was in the Philippines.
Okay.
He's the one that was in the Philippines.
I wanted to thank him for his service. Because
Yeah,
From what I've read, those American servicemen or any serviceman worldwide that was captured by the Japanese were treated in a far worse manner than those captured by German.
absolutely.
German army.
I mean, my father had to, when my father was applying for disability, that wasn't true. So you had to prove that you needed disability. And he had to write his internment story. And to this day,
Have you read that?
I know it by heart, and it's part of the presentation I do. I read his
Oh, I
works.
think that's excellent. Why don't you do that here?
Well, you have to ask for it.
Oh, all right.
Can you do that here? There you go.
You have to ask them
That
for
would
it.
be so interesting, a first-hand report. I had a brother, who of course was now deceased, and a future brother-in-law, both of whom were serving on a hospital ship in Pearl Harbor on the day it was bombed.
Yeah.
So those people also had stories. However, if anybody else was like the two I mentioned, they never spoke of it.
Oh, my dad would only tell us the funny stories. We didn't learn about the tough times until
Till you read it.
he did say some things, but not in the depth of what he wrote.
Of course.
And so the American Defenders of Bataan and Corregidor became a national organization and supported all of the survivors. They did not have the suicide rates that our soldiers have now because they were men and women who had gone through these experiences that supported each other. And my father knew how to organize. And they had conventions every year. My whole childhood was the American Defenders of Bataan and Corregidor, going to picnics and banquets and whatever. But every year they had a convention where people would share their stories, and the stories are endless. And in 2009, my father had passed away. It was the last convention that was run by the men, and now it's run by the descendants, me and my brothers and sisters. There's When my mother married my father, the Army doctor, he was still in the Army, told her, well, you know, he'll die before he's 55 and you won't have any kids. And he lived to be 92 and they had 5 kids. And they would have had more if there wasn't the rhythm method.
What do they know, right?
Right.
May I ask, Ann, your father sounds fascinating, and I hope you get to do that, but when he left the service and came out, what kind of profession did he go into?
So the first thing he did, okay, so my father's survivor's guilt was volunteerism.
Yep,
So first he worked for the Red Cross.
yep,
And then he realized he needed to make some money, and he was going to school on the GI Bill, studying communication. He wanted to be a talk show host, and he actually, at Boston University, did interview a young Senator JFK for the WBUR. But then he went into electronics, and he eventually became a international traffic manager for Honeywell when computers took up the whole room. But he volunteered, he was majorly involved in the American Defenders of Bataan and Corregidor. He volunteered at church in the Holy Name Society. We were always driving the nuns someplace because we all went to Catholic schools. He volunteered for the St. Vincent de Paul Society. He was in the Elks, the DAV, the VFW.
When did he sleep?
Yeah, when did he sleep? He was a busy fellow, but
Where did you guys grow up?
Belmont.
Belmont,
Oh,
okay.
Yeah.
really?
Not
Nice
sure.
town.
In a 2-family house, which I cried over because we lived in Weymouth in a
What part of Weymouth?
Pine Street.
I live in North Weymouth. Okay.
Yeah, South Weymouth, I think it is.
Yeah.
So we had, with the GI Bill, they built this 5-room, single, ranch house in Weymouth. And we had lots of land around us. And we moved to Belmont. We have a little tiny backyard. We're in a 2-family, and I hated it. But it was a good place to grow up. And then
school systems for you?
private, the Sacred Heart.
Yeah,
Yeah. And then I went to BC. Went to Matignon and BC, of course, right?
not in Cambridge.
Yeah. But when I was 17, we moved to a lovely Garrison Colonial right outside of Belmont Center. So we moved up. We moved
So
up
you
a
went to
bit.
school in Weymouth up
No.
till you were 17?
I went to a kindergarten nursery school, and when we moved to Belmont, and I was 5.
Oh, I thought you said you were 17 when you moved there. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I was 17 when we moved to the second house in Belmont.
Oh, okay, I thought you said you were 17.
Yeah, my mother took me to the public school and said, I'm not putting her in the first year of kindergarten. She's too smart for that. So I took a little test, and I was in the second year, and so I started first grade at 5. So I was always younger. I graduated from college. I had just turned 17, and I went right to Boston College, where in those days, the nursing school, you worked 3 days a week in a hospital, and my first year was at Boston City Hospital.
Wow.
And I could write a whole book on that.
Exactly, I would
So you
think-
started at 5, I started at 5 too, so your birthday must be at the end of the year.
March.
Oh, really? Mine was October, but when I started school, I was still 5. I didn't turn 6 until October.
Yeah.
So I started school like maybe a month at the most,
Yeah.
5 years old.
Yeah.
Because usually if you make the date.
Yeah, but my mother had me take a test so I could start early, because I was too smart.
So the apple didn't fall far from the mom's tree.
Guess not. My mother used to tell all her friends, my daughter went to Boston College to become an actress, and somewhere along the line she became a nurse, because I was in all the drama productions. And my whole entire life has basically been taking care of teenage moms or teenagers, because I worked in a school-based health center. So tell me that isn't improv every day, working with
And
teenagers,
if you
right?
were an actress, you could have played a nurse on TV.
Yeah, I could have.
You earned a star in your heavenly crown.
I consider this an extension of that, right? Because you walk into a room, you have a script, but you never know where it's going to go. You meet new people. You have to be on your toes. And I'm always asked one question I don't know the answer to, and I have to go back and look things up. But
That's good.
But I-
That's even more alert.
yeah, and what better job could one have in retirement, I pick and choose when I want to work, and I love everything I teach.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here. Maybe I'll come back.